everybody, how you doing? Well, that's good. I am Charlie O'Connor with PHLY Flyers. Welcome to the PHLY Flyers show presented by Mortgage CS. Check out mortgagecs.com/PHLY to start your home buying process today. Company NMLS ID number 1464766. Today, I have with me the great JP Zapata. JP,
Charlie.
thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, man.
Of course.
How you doing?
Doing okay. Got some color this weekend on the beach.
Nice. Where beach you go to?
Down the shore, Sea Isle. So,
nice.
So it was nice. Watched some Phillies and then hit the beach up and got some color. Got some beach time.
Did you like the morning baseball on Sunday?
I did. Would have been better if it ended with a different outcome.
For sure.
But the game itself was fun. It was nice. Wake up, go for a little run, come back, and then just flip on the game.
Seems to be popular. The Sunday morning game
wasn't bad.
It wasn't bad at all. Now I got to ask you, were you at that Prague Flyers game a couple years ago?
I did not go. No, unfortunately, I had not. The trip I took to Europe was the first time this summer. Nice. It was the first time I've ever been to Europe, so I did not go to the Prague game.
Well, it has me think because obviously, listen, the Eagles are going to be in Brazil this upcoming fall. The Phillies all the fan base did a great job representing in London. We need another Flyers international trip. I just love seeing Philadelphia on an international stage.
Yeah.
The way we just show up. Like, we took over London for a whole weekend. It's so much fun. So I definitely want to see the Flyers back on international grounds.
It would be cool, especially if it happens. Look, I am extremely biased in thinking that Philadelphia fans are the best sports fans in the world.
Sure.
And, screw the Mets. But, let's be honest. One of the reasons why the Phillies fans traveled so much better than Mets fans is because Phillies fans are actually excited about their team. Mets fans are completely disillusioned with theirs because it's a total dumpster fire. So the next time the Flyers get an international game, I hope that it's when the team is legitimately exciting and popular and good. Not when they are just what they are now, which is a middle-of-the-road to bad team.
Also, baseball doing a great job too, but bringing those rivalries to this international fan base is so cool. So, Pittsburgh and Philly would be a lot of fun on the ice somewhere.
It sure would.
Really cool.
It sure
cool.
would. So later in the show, we will get to talk to Alex Appleyard. I've worked with Alex for years. He was a contributor at The Athletic Philly when I was there. He writes articles for our diehards here at PHLY, and he's something of a draft expert, has been for years. So we're bringing Alex on to talk draft. But before we get into that, that's going to be more the second half of the show. I want to catch up on the events of the weekend. And really, there were two main events. Number one, Game 1 of the Stanley Cup Final. Number 2, the NHL Combine. But let's be honest. There is one big story coming out of the Stanley Cup Final Game 1, Edmonton versus Florida. And it was Sergei Bobrovsky, who was the only reason why Florida won Game 1. Only reason. He was unreal. He makes 32 saves on 32 shots, pulls the shutout. He faces 4.01 expected goals, gives up 0 actual goals. Edmonton controlled that game basically from start to finish. They were the better team from a skater standpoint. One team had a goalie that stood on his head, and one team had a goalie who was just and that was the difference. And unsurprisingly, look, the national story is, look how great Sergei Bobrovsky is. Totally warranted. The local story is, oh my God, Sergei Bobrovsky, do you need to jab the knife in even deeper? Because every Flyers fan knows that who was the team that brought Sergei Bobrovsky over to the United States, the NHL in the first place. It sure was the Philadelphia Flyers who signed him as an unrestricted free agent, brought him over from Russia. He spends his first 2 seasons in the NHL with the Flyers, the first as a surprise starting goalie for them in 2010-2011, the second as a backup to Ilya Bryzgalov. I would say the big story, particularly on social media, understandably so, in the Flyers world, was how could they have let this star-level goalie, who is now 35 going on 36 and potentially could be in the midst of leading his team to a Stanley Cup, led them to a Cup final last year. It was one of the big pieces. How could they have let him go? And I'm just going to give a little rundown of what happened.
Yeah.
In terms of Bob and Philly. So Bob gets signed. He not only makes the team out of camp, but he has such a good camp that he ends up being the number 1 goalie on the depth chart to start the season for the Flyers, a team that had just that previous summer gotten to the Cup final, took the Chicago Blackhawks to 6 games. Suddenly, you've got a rookie goalie, a 22-year-old rookie, the starting goalie for a team with designs on the cup. And for the first 3 quarters of that season, I would say that he was a really good starting goalie. Tailed off a little bit at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Then the whole thing kind of comes apart in the playoffs. The beginning of game 2, he gives up a weak goal, and Peter Laviolette, as he tended to do, he's a little crazy when it comes to goalies. He basically just gives up on Bob right then and there. He's like, okay, I'm done. This kid just doesn't have it. He's worn down. Maybe he just didn't think he had the mental side of the game down. Decides, okay, I'm going to go goalie crazy. Then we have Brian Boucher comes in. They end up trying Michael Leighton out for a little bit in that Buffalo series. They win the series in spite of goalie craziness. Then against Boston, they get swept. And what happens that summer, famously, is Ed Snyder basically goes to them, GM Paul Holmgren, and says, I'm sick of this goalie bullshit. Get me the best goalie on the market. I'm done. We're never doing this again. So Paul Holmgren trades for the rights to Ilya Bryzgalov, and then in order to sign him to a deal that fits under the cap, he signs into a 9-year, $51 million contract, and as that's being announced, also trades away Mike Richards and Jeff Carter, completely reshapes the franchise. Now, that's the big news of the day. They sign Briz, they trade Carter and Richards.
Mm-hmm.
The secondary consequence of that, however, is you now have a 31-year-old starting goalie in Ilya Bryzgalov signed through the rest of his 30s. You have a 23-year-old goalie in Sergei Bobrovsky who doesn't want to be a backup. Spends the second year of his entry-level contract as a backup behind Briz. Finishes with an .899 save percentage that season in 29 games as the primary backup. And then apparently, and this is according to the Great Flyers at 50 book that Greenberg did a few years ago. Really good, highly recommend. Basically, Bob's camp went to the Flyers and said, we have 1 more year left on our ELC. If he's just going to be the backup for the rest of his career behind Ilya Bryzgalov, we're not signing another contract with you. We will go back to Russia and he'll just play in the KHL for the rest of his career. No worries. He has no desire to stay in the NHL as a backup. So as a result, the Flyers that summer, the summer of 2012, they trade him to the Columbus Blue Jackets for a 2nd-round pick and 2 4th-round picks. The rest is history. That year, Sergei Bobrovsky wins the Vezina in the shortened season in 2012, 2023, or 2013. Ilya Bryzgalov has another bad year. They end up using a compliance buyout on him, and the Flyers lost a goalie who, for the next 10-plus years, is one of the better goalies in hockey. I guess, JP, how did it get to this point where you have a guy in Bob who is young, has shown a ton of talent, and you screw it up so badly that he is threatening to walk away and not re-sign with you to the point where you have to trade him or else you're going to get nothing back for him at the end of that contract?
Well, it's like a panic move, right? And like it felt like a lot of the moves during the early 2010s, there was a lot of panic going on, right? Like you weren't having a lot of success. You know, obviously Snyder wanted to win. And that's who he always was, and always wanted to spend money because obviously that's, you want to win, you're going to spend the dough. But you know, Charlie, like, I'm hearing this story, and I'm like trying to go back to that time period, and I'm like thinking to myself, like, well, didn't we all have the same thoughts that Snyder in the front office had? Because like obviously that the 2011 playoffs wasn't great, right? You get swept by the Boston Bruins. The goalie position does not look great. So I feel like all of us at the same point, like we felt the same way. Like, let's go all in. Let's go find that goalie. If that's Bryzgalov, it's Bryzgalov. And, you know, a young goalie, you know, just let him go. And I think I felt like the fan base all felt the same way at that time. So it's hard now to look at it because, like, obviously, yeah, it would have been nice to keep Bob.
To have Bob through the entirety of the 2010s and him be the starter. It would have been cool.
He wins the Vezina in his first year with Columbus. So that makes it even worse here. But, like, at that time period, when you're signing Bryzgalov, like, looking back at it, it's hard to say, like, you know, at that time period that, no, we shouldn't have gone for Bryzgalov because of where that goalie position was. I mean, like, I think before that, I mean, like, we had a couple years of Roman Cechmanek, Ron Hextall, I would think, like, before that, where we had, like, consistent goalie play.
Yeah, you had Cechmanek in the pre-lockout. The goalie who was the guy in the beginning of the Holmgren era was Marty Biron. He was fine, but he wasn't a game changer. He was just okay. And they were okay with just okay. Then they go for Ray Emery the year they go to the Cup Final. He gets hurt. You end up having Leighton and Bush. Leighton is a massive surprise in the regular season, obviously, then gives up the awful goal in Game 6 of the Cup Final, but he provides a lot more than you expect. Then, Leighton, I believe, missed most of, if I remember correctly, I believe he missed most of the next season due to injury. Bush is there, but Bob ends up being the guy. I think really what it boils down to is you're right, that after that playoff run, with all the chaos of it, fans were like, this is ridiculous. I'm sick of this bullshit. We got to figure out the goalie position. This speaks to the flaws of Ed Snider, the owner, where he was at his core a fan. I mean, he ran the team. He was the chairman. He created the team. So he was obviously on a different level of fandom than everyone else. But at heart, he was a fan. And the great parts about that is that it was so obvious how much he cared. He would throw so much money into the team. The passion was unparalleled. There maybe isn't another owner, except for maybe peak Yankee Steinbrenner, who cared that much about the team that he owned, the team that he operated. But this was a moment where you needed patience. You needed someone in that front office, or you just needed Snyder to be able to look past the anger that fans are completely allowed to just embrace, because that's part of the fun of being a fan, is just completely embracing your emotions. They needed someone in that room to be like, Ed, I know it was frustrating that Bob didn't get the job done in these playoffs, that Labby lost faith in him. I get it. He's 22 going on 23. He's super talented. He's the guy for the future. Don't pull the plug on him yet. And either no one said that to Ed, or no one had the power to get through to Ed and convince him that this was the wrong play, because obviously the Briz signing blows up in their face. He lasts 2 years before they use the compliance buyout on him. It just, to me, I mean, the lesson here is more than anything, and I think the Flyers, maybe they haven't learned it fully, but they've definitely learned it more than they did during the Snyder era. You gotta give those young players a chance. You can't just pull the plug and give up on them after one bad playoff run, or one mediocre season, or one bad second half. Like, one guy I'm thinking of here is Joel Farabee. Has a great first half, great first 2/3 of the year, has a bad 1/3 of the final third of the season, and suddenly everybody's like, trade him. Like, Bob is a shining example of why you need to be patient with young guys. And for years, the Flyers weren't, and sometimes it didn't burn them, sometimes it did. This was a case where that lack of patience burned them, because all you needed to do really was give Bob another year or two, and it was going to click. The talent was there, it was going to click, and it did. Just didn't click in Philly.
Well, Charlie, look, I think the Bob situation is a good example to learn from, because I think right now what we have with our current goalie situation, look, I don't know what we have in Sam Ersson. We talked about it before. I don't know if he's a 1A, 1B, but he's shown me stuff, especially mentally, that he can start in this league. So I think that Bob situation is something that we can learn from with this current goalie situation.
Yeah.
As we're still trying to figure out this room as a whole.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because they are going to need to be patient with someone like Ersson. And Ersson's another example where there probably are fans. I would hope not a lot of fans that are watching and listening to the show, but there are fans who watch Ersson struggle over the final month and a half, 2 months of the season, and are out on him, or just like, nope, kid doesn't have it. Now, does it matter to them that Ersson was run into the ground from a workload standpoint? No, they watched him and they just decided that, this guy sucks. And you know what? Fans have every right to have their opinion about a guy. Like, I'm not saying that that's even a wrong evaluation. Maybe in 10 years, Sam Ersson, we can look back and be like, yeah, he just didn't have it. But that's a fan perspective. If you're running the team, you have to look at things with a wider eye. And I think the good thing about Ed Snider was that he was a fan. The bad thing about Ed Snider was that he was a fan. It was two sides of the same coin. Like, you had the great parts of it in that no one could match his passion as an owner. But you also had the negatives where that passion would lead him occasionally to give up on a Sergei Bobrovsky and go all on an Ilya Bryzgalov, who was 31 and never was likely to age particularly well anyway, because he was a 31-year-old goalie that you signed until he was 40. Like, how did you think this contract was going to go? But it was impulsive, driven by frustration of the moment. And that's the kind of stuff that this organization does need to get away from. especially in a cap year. And I think that was one thing that Mr. Snyder never fully got. We talked about it on the show, me and Bill especially, about how the pre-Hextall front offices, so post lockout, so after the salary cap was implemented, but pre-Hextall, because Hextall was the first one who did truly understand the cap. The idea was like, yeah, they understand there's a cap in concept, but they didn't really understand the implications of it. And I think Snyder still kind of had in his head the mentality of like, well, it doesn't matter if we're giving up on Bob because we'll just go out and buy a goalie. Like, that's what we've always done. You know, we went out and we got Van Beesbrook, and, you know, that's just what we do. They chase down Mike Richter. Like, we'll just throw money at the problem. And the thing is, you can't do that in a cap year. You have to think long term. You have to plan these things out. And that probably was the last time that Snyder went the full-on reactionary, impulsive route because, and I will always, it ultimately didn't work out, but I'll always give Ed Snyder credit on this one, is the fact that when he hired Ron Hextall and Ron Hextall told him, basically, I'm going to do a long-term plan, it's fairly clear that Snyder knew if they did a long-term plan, he was not going to live to see the end of the long-term plan. That he was already sick, and there was a good chance that he was not going to live to see the fruits of Hextall's labor. And he was like, you know what? No. I've made mistakes by being too impulsive, by thinking too short-term. Even if I don't get to see it, this is the right thing for the organization. And yes, Ron Hextall, do a long-term plan that I might not live to see the result of it. I'll always give him credit for that. Now, in retrospect, Ron Hextall probably wasn't the right guy to do it, but I respect that he was willing to take an honest look at his mistakes and say, no, this is a different era. We need to build a team differently. Hextall probably wasn't the right guy to do it. Maybe Danny Briere is, because it looks like Danny Briere is following a similar plan. Again, we'll see if it works, but I do think that the Flyers have learned from the issues that led to them losing Bob.
Yeah.
We're going to go to an ad read in a second. Before that, we do have a super chat from one Dylan Phillips. Watch FAF after it was live. I'm not sure what FAF is. Oh, F Around Friday.
Wow.
Thank you, Brenna. I was like, I've never seen that before. Is that some sort of podcast I'm not aware of? Was thinking about Friedman. Wondered if you knew what was up with him and why everyone on the team seemingly hated him. Well, the last I heard, he was with Vancouver. I believe he spent last year with Vancouver. There was a little bit of a stretch where he functioned as their third pair defenseman. Then he got, I think, pushed more into the regular healthy scratch run. But that's what happened to him. He's just bounced around. He's basically a number 6, number 7, number 8 guy on a depth chart. Probably will spend some time in the AHL. He's a quad A defenseman. Why everyone on the team hated him? My understanding is basically just that, like, it wasn't any one thing. It wasn't that, you know, he stole somebody's girlfriend or whatever. Like, it was just that he was a hyper intense kind of a dick. And he had a real sense of entitlement. He felt like he should be in the lineup all the time. He felt like he was better than players who had regular spots in the lineup. And I just think that attitude rubbed a lot of his teammates the wrong way, which is why when he came back while he was on the Penguins, the Flyers basically spent like the first 2 games going out of their way to make it hurt. I mean, they were trying to blow him up on the ice. It was very entertaining, actually, because there was clearly some tension there. But yeah, Dylan, thank you so much.
FAF, that's Dan Elfrey's favorite podcast.
I guess so. FAF, it's a new thing. Thank you, Dylan, for that. But going back to Sergei Bobrovsky for a second, you know, if you're thinking about Sergei Bobrovsky, game 2's tonight, and you're watching him make all these saves, and you just feel the anger boiling up inside of you, and you just think to yourself, I really need to chill. This isn't healthy. Make the choice to choose chill.
Absolutely.
And reach for a Coors Light. It's mountain cold refreshment. It's cold lagered, cold filtered, and cold packaged for a smoother finish. So yes, Sergei Bobrovsky not spending the entirety of his NHL career in Philadelphia. JP, it's cause for frustration. It's cause for anger. But you know what might calm you down? Seeing those blue mountains on a Coors Light can, telling you it's cold and ready to drink. I had a few on hand for that 10 a.m. Phillies game.
There you go.
May have cracked one when Jose Alvarado was in the midst of falling apart and completely not being able to find the strike zone. You know why?
Don't blame you.
Because I needed to chill.
That's
I
right.
needed to chill. So make the most out of the times you choose to chill. Choose Coors Light. Get Coors Light delivered straight to your door with Instacart by going to CoorsLight.com/PHLY hockey. Celebrate responsibly. Coors Brewing Company, Golden, Colorado. So want to go a little bit more in to the Bobrovsky situation.
Okay.
Because I do want to talk about his perception around the league right now.
Okay.
He's 35 years old, obviously. He probably doesn't have a ton more years left, but over the last 2 seasons, Florida gets to the Cup Final last year. Bobrovsky plays really well after retaking the starting job from another former Flyer, and Alex Lyon, who took them to the playoffs and started the playoffs as their starter. Then Bobrovsky took the job back. The second round, he was great, and then he just ran with it. And then obviously this year, Florida's back in the Cup Final with Bobrovsky as the unquestioned starter. But especially after Saturday's game, he was presented as this playoff stud, as this guy who, man, he's got ice in his veins, comes through in the clutch. He's everything you want a playoff goalie to be. Greg Wyshynski from ESPN, he published an article in March calling him Playoff Bob, interviewed a bunch of his teammates in Florida who, obviously just praised him up and down for how unflappable he is and whatnot. I tweeted this out on Saturday because I find it an utterly fascinating reframing of Sergei Bobrovsky's career. And here's why. Brenna, for those watching on YouTube, we're going to put this graphic up, and we're going to talk about Bobrovsky's first 4 playoff runs. 2011 with Philadelphia, .877 save percentage, loses the starting job by game 2. 2014 with Columbus, .908 save percentage, the Blue Jackets losing 6 in round 1 to Pittsburgh. 2017 with Columbus, .882 save percentage. They lose in 5 in round 1 to Pittsburgh. And then 2018 with Columbus, .900 save percentage. They lose in 6 in round 1 to Washington. Now, 2019, this is when he starts to turn the narrative. Right. But if we dial the clock back to March of 2019, Sergei Bobrovsky is 30 years old. His career regular season save percentage at that point in his life is .920. He is an unquestioned stud, one of the best regular season goalies in hockey. His career playoff save percentage is .891. It's nearly 30 points lower than his regular season rate. Now, he changes the narrative in 2019. The Blue Jackets pulled the amazing sweep upset of the Tampa Bay Lightning, at that point viewed as maybe one of the best teams ever. And from that point on, Bob plays much better in the playoffs. But age 30 Bobrovsky was viewed at the time, before that run, as a guy who just never came through. He choked in the playoffs. Here's my question for you. Let's say the Flyers keep him. Let's say they don't sign Ilya Bryzgalov, okay? They don't sign Briz. Maybe they keep Richards and Carter. Maybe they don't, but they don't sign Briz, and Bob becomes Bob in Philly. That he's the guy in the 2010s, the guy between the pipes for the Flyers. If he delivers these 4 results in his first 4 playoff runs in Philly, do Philadelphia fans and the Flyers decide that he is just a choker and then trade him anyway because he just doesn't have what it takes to succeed in the playoffs?
Well, I'll say, yeah, for sure. I mean, we all know how Philadelphia is. If this was the performances the first 4, I mean, we would have ran him out of town by the third one.
Yeah.
But Charlie, I mean, like, I think about his 2012 season where he won the Vezina. If he had that performance for the Flyers, what are we talking about here? Because that was a good Flyers team in 2012. That was a solid one.
Yeah. I mean,
could they have beaten the Devils in that year?
So that was the season where he was the backup, because he was still on the team in 2012.
He got traded that summer.
He was the backup to Briz. He gets in 1 game. The interesting question though is, what if his Vezina season, the 2012-2013 season, what if that is what he delivers in 2011-2012 as his second full season as the starter? What if by making him the backup, they just pushed it back because he just didn't have the mentality to be a backup. He needed to be an every night starter. That's a really, really good Flyers team that, you're right, they win the crazy series against the Penguins. They lose in 5 to the Devils. But if they have Vezina Bob that whole year, and then against the Devils, I don't know where that team ends.
Or even the 2014, when he was with the Blue Jackets, he had the .908 save percentage when they lose to the Penguins in round 1. That 2014, Bob, would that have been enough to beat the Rangers in round 1?
Interesting question. I mean, it wouldn't have been if he delivers the save percentage and the overall results that he does for the Blue Jackets, I would say no. I don't think he's substantially better than who they have. But again, if you get good playoff Bob, maybe. I just look back and I see a complete reframing of Sergei Bobrovsky's career, and that now everyone just is acting like he's always been this playoff stud.
Yeah.
And it's not true. For the first half of his career, it's not even that he wasn't a playoff stud. He was actively viewed as a poor playoff goalie.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why I think it's a fascinating conversation, because number one, it opens the door to the question of would the Flyers and would Flyers fans have just given up on him, that this guy can't cut it in the playoffs. Number two, and this is the really interesting debate, and I mean, I will fully admit that I'm framing this the way I want to frame it. Does it hint that the concept of playoff choker, that some guys, they just don't have what it takes to succeed in the big moments, that it's kind of bullshit? And that if you're a good player, you give a good player enough opportunities in the playoffs, and eventually he's going to perform in the playoffs. Like, do you basically with Bob, do you think that he was a choker and then learned how to play in the playoffs? Or do you think that he just happened to, for 4 weeks out of his long career before he was 30, just happened to be cold going into the playoffs each of those years, and now this is just positive regression? That these runs are just him kind of making up for the fact that he really wasn't that bad back then, and he really isn't that good now, that when you look at his career as a whole, it's going to be probably around the same in terms of his playoff performance versus his regular season performance.
I just think everyone has their own timetable, Charlie. And like for Bob, it took him until 2019 to finally fill into that role of being a playoff goalie, to perform well into in the playoffs. And that's goes back to your point earlier. And it's really about patience, because, you talked about in those first four playoff series for Bob, I don't think anyone anticipated him to become this. He's playing ridiculously right now. This run that the Panthers have been on this season, especially in the playoffs, has been ridiculous. And so I think what it is just that it just took time for Bob. And for some players, yeah, they might come into the league right away and play great, stand on their head. But for a guy like Bob, it took some time. And so that's why we're saying patience is key. Patience is key for a lot of these players.
I guess my view, and this is, again, my personal bias, I can't put myself in Sergei Bobrovsky's head. I don't know. And I'm sure he believes that he changed some things. Maybe he changed his prep before playoff games. Maybe he thinks a little bit differently before playoff games. I don't think he matured at all. I think he's the exact same guy. Okay. I think that playoff performance mostly is a fucking crapshoot. And he is the exact same guy now, mentally, that he was when he played bad against the Penguins when he was in his mid-20s. I just think that back then, he happened to have a bad playoff series. And we created a narrative around him being a choker, because that's what we do in the media and that's what we do as fans. And now, because he's playing well, we're creating a narrative that he's a great playoff goalie. Whereas in reality, he's just a good goalie. And if you were to stick with a good goalie who had a few bad playoff series, eventually he was going to figure out how to be good in the playoffs, which is kind of where what I'm getting at is, like, my view is that there are probably a few players in every generation that are legitimately clutch and legitimately are better when the stakes are up because they just thrive in it. There's probably a few players in every generation who legitimately are chokers. And then there's everybody else who, if you give them a large enough sample size, will pretty much play the exact same way they play in the regular season and the playoffs. It's just some guys don't get those large sample size. Some guys only get one opportunity to be in the playoffs. And what if they just had a head cold that week and they played at 80%? And now they are thought of their entire career as, well, he didn't get it done in the playoffs. Like a guy who's somebody who I look to about this?
Who's that?
Travis Konechny.
Okay.
Travis Konechny's playoff numbers are not good. They're not. They're actively bad. I do not think he is a choker. I do not think there is anything about Travis Konechny that tells me that he should not be able to perform in the playoffs. It's just that he hasn't. He hasn't performed yet. But I would not, like, I don't think it's a smart move necessarily to re-sign Travis Konechny for other reasons. But one thing that plays absolutely zero role, in my opinion, as to why they should and should not keep Travis Konechny is the idea that he stinks in the playoffs. Because while he hasn't been good in the playoffs yet, I very well think that if the Flyers make the playoffs next year, I would expect Travis Konechny to be very good in the playoffs.
Okay.
Because I do not think there is anything in his game that tells me that he is a inherently true talent, poor playoff performer. Is it possible that he's one of the 4 or 5 guys in this generation who does just stink in the playoffs? I guess it's possible. I can't rule it out. I don't think it's likely. I think he's just a good player who has happened to struggle in the couple playoff series he's been in. And if you give him 3, 4, 5 more playoff series, he'll have good playoff series because he's a good player.
Another key point too to mention as well, not only for Travis Konechny, but for Bob. Bob right now is playing with one of the most complete teams that we've seen in a while in the Florida Panthers. And it feels like it's their year. Like the whole run, like their vibes that they've had, it feels like it is their season. But that definitely does help Bob right now. I mean, he's playing fantastic hockey, especially in between the pipes. But I mean, this Florida team is really good.
They are really good. And JP,
yeah,
you know what else is really good?
What's that, Charlie?
Ollipop.
I love me some Ollipop, ladies and gentlemen. All right, guys, let's talk real quick about our friends over at Ollipop. All right, because listen, we're watching Stanley Cups. Some of us may be drinking the Coors Light, but some of us, we want to drink our Ollipop during the game, all right? And it's one of my favorites. I just had one right before going on the air because we just had some of the Big Dom sandwiches here in the studio, which, by the way, are fantastic. Brandon and Charlie, make sure you guys get a piece of that as well.
Will do.
Had a little Ollipop with it, went down smoothly. And let me tell you why I love Ollipop. Because, listen, I still get the hankering for some soda. Who doesn't, right? It's that classic taste that we all grew up loving. And Ollipop is trying to create it for you. But we're trying to be healthy in 2024, guys, because we got to take care of that gut, okay? And that's what Ollipop does. It's the world's first functional soda with that classic soda taste and has the benefits of plant-based fiber, prebiotics, and other botanical ingredients that supports that gut health. And this is the best part about Ollipop. They only have 2 to 5 grams of sugar with 9 grams of fiber. That's where my health nut loves the most because of that right there. Those 2 factors right there. And guys, listen, we all go to Wawa every morning. We get our cup of Joe. We get our gas, whatever it may be. You can now go and get your cup of Joe and then get your Ollipop for lunch right in the fridge. It's located right there for you with all the classic flavors they have, your traditional Coca-Cola, your root beer, whatever it may be. You can find it at Wawa. If not, we can still head on over to Target, Sprouts, Wegmans, ShopRite, get it delivered with Go Puff at your front door, whatever it may be. And of course, we have you covered with that promo code as always. Because right now, if you use the promo code PHLY20, that'll get you 20% off that next Ollipop order. However, this discount only applies to one-time orders and not to subscription orders. Ollipop is sold online at drinkollipop.com, or you can find it on Amazon here. So guys, for your next pizza night this upcoming Friday, if you're getting some sandwiches in the city, choose an Ollipop here, guys.
Choose an Ollipop. It's great stuff. I highly recommend. Big fan of the orange one, especially.
Oh, it's great.
But really, really into the Ollipop. And out of these prebiotic drinks, they haven't been recently sued. So Ollipop's got that going for them. They have not been recently sued for false advertising. So
I saw
go with
that.
Ollipop. Anyway, before we get into the Alex Appleyard segment, we have that coming. I do want to talk a little bit about the NHL Combine, which was late last week into the weekend. Going to do some quick little rumor roundup for everybody. If you weren't following along on social and reading all the articles from the people who were there, I obviously was not, but give you a little rumor roundup. And then I do want to have a quick conversation about one of the big points of discussion that came up this weekend. But some rumor roundup, Chicago took Artem Levshunov out to dinner. Levshunov sort of implied that Chicago has expressed significant interest in him all year. If you want to learn more about Levshunov, I did do my prospect preview series, which is all on YouTube. Check that out. Interesting, though, the idea that maybe he might be the consensus favorite now to go number 2, which makes you wonder, with Ivan Demidov, where might he slip to? Could he slip all the way to 5? If Anaheim and Columbus, as rumored, go with defensemen, that's been the general consensus that both those teams might be more looking on the defenseman side. Then there's Russ Cohen, who goes by Sportsology on Twitter. He's a good follow. He had some Flyers stuff. He said with regards to Carter Yakimchuk, he confirmed that Yakimchuk did speak with the Flyers. This is the quote, smiled. I think there is a real chance the team is hoping to get him in the 12th spot. So Russ Cohen's thinking Yakimchuk could potentially be a target. He had a little thing about Berkly Catton, quote, spoke to 22 teams, so anybody in the top 20 is a candidate to take him. He will go sometime after 7. It was confirmed that Catton did get dinner with Utah at 6, and Catton measured at 5'10" and 175 pounds, which is at least weight-wise a little bit higher than what he was listed in juniors. Cohen also reported the Flyers spoke with Swedish defenseman Leo Salin-Wallenius and Teddy Stiga. Stiga is a guy who I actually really like a lot as a potential option for that second first-round pick. Here's the big question, though, JP.
Okay.
There's always weird questions that get asked to prospects at the Combine. Montreal is well known for asking about what animal do you think you are? And players know that if they're going to go into an interview with Montreal, they're going to get asked the stupid animal question. They got to come in prepared. The big one that had some writers complaining and some writers saying, no, I get it, was Utah at the Combine apparently was asking players for their Uber rating. And for older viewers and listeners who don't understand this, basically what it is that when you use Uber, you as the rider can rate the drivers. But the drivers also have the ability to rate you in terms of, whether you were on time for your pickup, whether you were a dick in the car, whether you were
threw up in the car,
whether you were disruptive, whether you threw up in the car, things like that. So you have a personal rating too, and that influences, like, for example, let's say somebody has a choice between picking up two guys and one person has a 4.95 out of 5 and one person has a 4.4 out of 5. They're probably going to pick the guy with the higher rating to pick up on the ride. Here's the question. Some writers thought that this was a ridiculous question to ask prospects, that it was invasive and that it was just stupid and didn't make any sense, that had no relevancy to prospect evaluation. Do you think this is a good question or a bad question to ask?
Well, first off, I want to thank Kelly Hinkle, who brought this to my attention on Twitter. I saw her quote tweeting this. Ironically enough, that possibly the team called Utah Hockey Club was asking this.
Utah HC, baby. Represent.
But honestly, Charlie, like, it feels like an exercise to kind of connect with the millennials and the Gen Zers and all that. But you do raise a good point because, listen, I was young once, right? We've all done some dumb stuff. But, if you are someone in the Uber ride being super disruptive, being super rude, that's probably something you don't want to have represent your hockey team, right? So there is some legitimacy with this. It's just odd. And it's just very 2024. Because, like, who thinks about looking at someone's Uber rating?
Yeah. It's a very weird question. I feel like for me with Uber ratings, the only time I ever think about it is like if I happen to be with a group of friends and it comes up, it's like, who has the highest Uber rating? And then we all look at it. And it's like, oh, who's the asshole with the 4.7? Man, like, how many times did you get blackout drunk in an Uber in your 20s?
Literally.
Like, it's just one of those stupid, like, conversations you have at like a house party or something and it turns into just like everybody laughing at somebody. But I personally actually kind of like it. And the reason is because I think, and this has always been my opinion, I think that you can learn maybe more than anything else about a person. You can learn more about watching how they treat service employees. So I'm talking about waiters and waitresses. I'm talking about, like people in a hotel, the people who clean your room, the people at the front desk, people on an airplane, people in the airport. Like, because those people are just doing their jobs. Is it possible that, like, sometimes they could be rude and obnoxious too? Sure. Like, sometimes they're in the wrong. But most of the time what you have is people just trying to do their jobs and people, like, annoying people treating service employees like dirt. And Uber drivers are essentially service employees. They're basically upgraded taxi drivers, except they don't have a medallion, they have an app. And I think if you look at a kid's Uber number and it's real low, you have to wonder if because, like, look, all these kids are on their best behavior at the Combine when they're talking to GMs and scouts, because these are the people that hold their future in their hands and they're trying to put on their best impression. They're not necessarily trying to put on their best impression for an Uber driver. They're just trying to get from point A to point B. And if the player has an enormous ego and treats everyone below him like dirt, that might show up in the Uber number in a way that wouldn't show up if he's talking to a GM who he's trying to impress. So I actually thought it was a pretty clever way to maybe get at the
outside the box,
get at the heart of the real character these guys have, not just the character they're trying to present to the GM in a formalized setting.
Well, how you carry yourself is super important.
It's really important.
Especially you're talking about these multi-million-dollar entities that are trying to give you a job here. They want to make sure that you are carrying yourself in the proper way. Because God forbid, you don't want to have an issue where, a story comes out in the next couple of years of you being an a-hole.
And not even that. Like, yes, when this prospect has a meeting with the GM or, the assistant GM or one of the lead scouts or whatever, they're going to be on their best behavior. But if that guy gets drafted and now he's on the team, he might not be on his best behavior every day. And if this is someone who treats Uber drivers like crap, who's to say that if an Uber driver just is like, hey, would you mind like buckling up your seatbelt? And they're just like, fuck you, old man, you asshole. How do you think they're going to respond to a coach when a coach asks them to make an adjustment to their game? Are they someone who has problems with, anybody giving them any direction whatsoever? I feel like that can come through. So I personally, despite the fact that there were some journalists who didn't like it, I actually thought it was kind of genius in a weird 2024 sort of way. I personally liked it.
So when you were interviewing for PHLY and they asked you for the Uber rating, what would you have said?
I mean, the one thing somebody pointed out is like they could have the player could have just lied, could have just looked at the phone and been like, sees it's like 4.3. It's like, oh, it's 4.92. What are they gonna do? Like, just lock your phone up. They're never gonna know. But I guess you get thrown so much, and probably people don't even know what a good rating versus a bad rating is. So they more likely are just to be honest and just give the real number, and then hey. We do have a super chat from Gary B before we get to an ad read and then the Alex Appleyard interview. Gary B, hey, Charlie, think Zane Parekh will be available at 12. I think he could be a 1D. I'm not sure. He's a right-handed shot. He scored a ton of points in juniors. You have heard some rumors that he could slip because he's not that big. He has some defensive concerns. I don't think he'll be available at 12. But it's possible. I don't think he's a lock to be taken in the top 10 the way that, say, Lev Shunov or Demidov or even Caden Lidstrom. Like, those guys, I think, are locks to be gone long before the Flyers pick. I do think it's theoretically possible that Parekh could be available. I do wonder, however, if the Flyers might show some pause because his skill set, at least in theory, is a little redundant with Drysdale. They're both righty shots. They're both smallish. They both project as power play one quarterbacks. The skill set, they're both incredible lateral skaters. I'm just not sure if that's a little bit redundant in terms of skill set. That said, Parekh's a really good prospect, and he has the upside. I agree. He has the upside to be a 1D if he figures out the defensive side of his game, if he adds a little bit more energy and compete to his play without the puck. I think he could be really good. So my answer is probably not, but I guess don't rule it out entirely. Thank you, Gary B, for the super chat.
Awesome stuff. All right, real quick, guys. I want to talk to you guys about the Bet Parks Casino that we have here. We have one in Bensalem. We have the racetrack down in South Philly as well. But listen, the one in Bensalem is, guys, this is insane. It's ridiculous. It's huge. It's absolutely wild what they got going on there. I want to tell you some of the events that are going to be coming up here because they have a lot going on here in the next couple months. And you want to start marking down those calendars, all right? The FEMSA Rock Play Classic Rock on Violins. Cool Act and the headline at Parks Casino this Friday night. We have Sebastian Bach, former lead singer of Skid Row, brings his solo tour to headline on Saturday night. On August 23rd, we have Southern Rock, the Marshall Tucker Band. September 7th, the Australian Pink Floyd. Plus, your guys are going to love this one. From the TV show Jersey Shore.
Oh, boy.
The It's Happening podcast, live with Snooki and Joey. We're still not sure who Joey is. Are coming to Parks Casino on June 20th. I know my fiance is going to love that one. Also, comedian Michael Blaustein is coming on October 25th. All at Parks Casino, the #1 casino experience in the state of Pennsylvania. Parks Casino, this is how you win. They have it all. It's my casino of choice. Parks Casino has 3,200 state-of-the-art slots, 115 live table games, a beautiful poker room, state-of-the-art sportsbook lounge. I love that. With a 150-foot video wall plus the ultra-cool X Lounge. Dining options are amazing at Parks Casino. Collection of award-winning restaurants, the Parks Grill Steakhouse, the Liberty Bell Gastropub, and Beer Garden. Delicious sushi hand rolls at Bamboo Noodle House. Check out the New York's best club comedians every other Thursday night. and the best cover bands every weekend at the 360 Lounge. So guys, visit parkscasino.com. Parks Casino, this is how you win. Must be 21 or older. Gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER.
JP, thanks so much.
Not a
And
problem.
now we set the stage a little bit with the Combine talk. We had a little bit of Bobrovsky conversation at the beginning, but we're now ready to jump full into draft conversations, and we're going to bring on one Alex Appleyard. And joining the PHLY Flyers show, we have Alex Appleyard, regular contributor here at PHLY, also writes for Smart Scouting. Alex and I have worked together for quite a while, dating back to my time at The Athletic. He is, as I'm sure all of you know, a prospect watcher and scout extraordinaire. Alex, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be on.
Yeah, happy we could get you on one of these shows. The work you've been doing for us since we launched has been great, but so far it's just been on the written side. So really good to get you on the show for a segment with, of course, the NHL Draft coming up at the end of the month. Now, for those that maybe aren't as familiar with Alex's work, he's been studying prospects for at least a decade, if not longer.
I think properly, probably a decade, but I've been watching hockey now for like almost as long as I've been alive, so almost 30 years or something. And yeah, our prospects have always been kind of the area where I always just like enjoyed watching younger players and seeing development. I think it kind of runs in my family. Like my great uncle's a professional soccer scout, and yeah, so always had that kind of like how players develop, like what makes a player go from like a good junior player to a good pro in the back of my mind. So yeah, and now it's become, well, semi part-time job, I think.
Exactly. No, I just remember the days before I was even at The Athletic and just being on Twitter and always really valuing your insights that you would put on there about prospects, about the Flyers in general. And then obviously when I joined The Athletic, it was like, I want Alex to be one of the regular contributors. And here we are. But with regards to this draft, as you said, you've been scouting drafts for over a decade. You've been a hockey fan basically your entire life. Where would you say this draft falls in terms of quality relative to, the last 10 plus years worth of drafts?
I would say overall, it's probably a slightly above average draft. And I think people are slightly down on this draft in some ways simply because of the quality of drafts we've had in the last few years, where you've effectively had like a generational player or potentially two in some drafts like we saw last year. And next year is also probably a stronger draft than this as well. But I do think on overall it's above average. And I would say that really the strength of it is carried by the defenseman. I think the quality of a defenseman in this draft is potentially up there, I think, with maybe like 2018 or so as like one of the better drafts for defensemen, or even, 2015, where there was like quite a lot of guys who came out as good players. I don't think it's quite the level of like the 2008 draft where there was just like defenseman after defenseman after defenseman, and lots of them became, number one D-men. But I think this draft's going to have great potential on the back end, and I think the weakness is really kind of at the center position, actually, in terms of both kind of top end and some level of depth. There are a group of really good centers, but then there's kind of in the middle of the first round, it kind of really falls off a cliff, and I think there's only probably going to be about 4, potentially 5 guys in this entire draft who have like clear top 6 center upsides, 1C or a 2C. So overall, I would say it's above average, but I can understand why people are slightly down on it versus others.
Gotcha. Yeah, because it definitely seems like there isn't the same level of excitement, but maybe in comparison to, and maybe this was influenced just by the top of the draft, but I'm thinking back to the 2022 draft when the Flyers took Gauthier, like that seemed to be viewed as a weaker draft, especially at the top end. And then last year was viewed, at least in my memory, as a very strong one.
Yeah, exactly. So I would say, yeah, just above average, nothing bad, nothing amazing. But I do think the defensemen in this draft I think if you look back in 10 years, there'll be so many NHL defensemen who came from this draft, and not just first rounders as well, guys who are taken in the second, third, and fourth, because there are so many good guys in defensive roles.
Gotcha. Well, obviously for Flyers fans, and not their only focus, but the main focus is going to be on pick number 12. That's the top pick. It's where you have the highest likelihood of getting an impact guy who can be, maybe that top of the lineup, high-end talent that this team so desperately needs. you've done a ton of work on this draft. You have opinions on so many of the guys in this draft. But if you're looking at realistic preferences, I mean, obviously you'd love for the Flyers to get Macklin Celebrini. That's not going to happen. But if we're talking about realistic preferences at 12, give me your top 3 options.
I would say in terms of realistic, maybe I'm optimistic on all 3 of them. I think there's a world where none of them are going to get to 12, but I think for me it would be Berkly Catton, Costa Helenius, and Zane Parak. I think all 3 of them have a chance to get to 12, and I would say it's like 50-50 that one of them does. And I think those 3 guys are semi-realistic and probably the best the Flyers could do pretty much in this draft, given the quality of players and also how the draft is probably going to roughly fall.
So you're definitely a Berkly Catton fan. What is the what's the selling point for you on him that makes him your ideal, I guess, top option?
I mean, for me, it's just what I look for generally in a center is 2 things that he has in spades, and that's being high skilled and also having a really high hockey IQ. I really love the way that he controls the game. You know, people talk about him being extremely deceptive and having plus speed and really great hands and a good shot and a good passer. But the things that really define his game for me is he's fantastic in transition and incredible at creating space. And he's one of those players, which I think a lot of the top centers in the NHL have, where he dictates the pace of play when he's on ice. You know, if he wants to speed things up, he'll speed things up. If he wants to slow things down, he'll slow things down. But in general, he does play with like quite a high pace through the neutral zone, transitions the puck really well. And his IQ is extremely high. And from a skill perspective, I think personally, only Celebrini and Demidov are more skilled than him in the draft. He might not kind of have the real highlight reel moves that they do, but he can beat men one-on-one, has really plus hands. And I quite like the way he beats guys. He usually goes quite direct, like just does one move, makes them, you know, take a misstep and then goes past them. So he's probably my top option that the Flyers could potentially have. And if it was me, you know, in an NHL front office, he would be in my top 5 in the entire draft, potentially as high as 3, although I would maybe take 1 or 2 of the defensemen over him. But yeah, he's, I think, the best the Flyers can possibly do. And I know a few months ago, you know, if you said Berkly Catton, someone would say like, well, there's no chance he's getting to 12. But I think a really good, you know, look at the draft in general is like the TSN guys like Bob McKenzie and Craig Button, whether you agree with their opinion or disagree with their opinion, in general, it aligns quite closely usually with how NHL teams are thinking because they speak to NHL scouts and NHL GMs. And I think McKenzie has him at 10 and Button has him at 14. So the ability for him to fall to 12 is realistic. And I think as we've seen draft after draft after draft, guys with that kind of profile who are skilled, put up a lot of points, but are, you know, 5'10", it's not out of the realms of possibility that he's going to fall because we saw that with Benson. We saw that with, I mean, Chris Stell last year who fell enormously. It happens every draft or every 2 drafts. So I think there's a potential for him to be there. And I think that is really best case scenario.
And then another guy who you mentioned is your number 2, which is interesting to me, is Costa Helenius. Now, obviously, you do a ton of work on the European side, so I'm sure you've seen a bunch of him. The concern that I've had with him, and this is something that we talked to Chris Peters last week, and he mentioned as well, is just the idea of what is his upside. It seems clear he's going to be a good player. Can he be a great player? And I think there's some skepticism there. Do you think that he could have top of the lineup upside?
Yeah, I think there's potential there for him to be a number 1 center. I don't think there's the potential for him to be, you know, a standout top 10 center in the NHL, but I think there's a chance for him to be a kind of guy who puts up 75 to 85 points in, you know, a good year. And if your team has him as your number 1 C, you're not going to be ecstatic, but You're going to be like, okay, this guy can play that position and play it well. I think there's a lot of positives that are overlooked because it's true, he doesn't really have those standout specific skill sets apart from being extremely like intelligent on ice. Like he dictates play when he's on ice and he plays a really mature game as well. And I think when you start watching him on a regular basis, you realize that it's kind of like the way he wins is just death by 1,000 cuts. Like he makes all the little plays correctly. He plays a very mature game despite not being the biggest guy. He drives play. He's a really good transition player. And I think his transition game is kind of overlooked because he's not the fastest and not the most skilled. And I also think this year he was kind of unlucky. You know, he put up really, really impressive figures, you know, 0.71 points per game in Liga, which is, you know, one of the top 5 men's leagues in the world, and then showed at the international level he could hang with guys who played in the NHL as well. But he only shot something like 6% this season, and he doesn't have a bad shot, you know. He's good at getting his shot off. I think he was a bit unlucky in that regard. And people do criticize his speed, but I think one of the interesting things, obviously, like speed and functional speed are different.
Sure.
But Liga do have like the smart puck technology, so we actually know what his top speed was this year, and it was 23.6 miles an hour, which is not slow. When he gets going, he can skate. So for me, I think if Catton wasn't there, I think he would be the best chance that the Flyers had in the draft to potentially get like a good top 6 center. And while I'm not one on, really high floors are impressive, for me, like if a guy is like only going to be a 45-point player in an NHL, you don't take that player 12th overall. You try and swing on someone higher, but I do think that he has a really high floor as well, to go with potentially being a 1C. And I understand why some people don't think he's going to stick at C. I understand why they might think he's going to kick out to the wing. But the fact of the matter is he did play center this year in Liga and did a really good job. So for me, he's not got the upside that Catton has, but he does have that potential to kind of just about get to 1C level and probably be, 15th, 20th best center in the league, which is nothing to sniff at in the position that is of most need really in the entire NHL and is the biggest scarcity really.
Yeah, it's a fair point. Looking at because obviously you're going to have different opinions on the consensus for a lot of guys, but if you're talking about the names that people know, the bigger name, well-known prospects, is there a bigger name player that you would say you're lower than what seems to be the industry consensus on?
I would say Silyev. I've watched a lot of Silyev, and there's people talking about a potential top 5 pick. And while I think his physical game's fantastic, he is a unicorn. A guy at that size who skates that well and has above average puck skills, I would say, are really hard to come across. But for me, every time I watch him, I just see him being a really good second pairing NHL defenseman. And I think when you put that up against some of the other defensemen in this draft class, when you're talking about, Levshinov and Dickinson and Boom, and even a guy like Perek, I don't think he has the upside that they potentially do, unless he comes on leaps and bounds. There's people talking about him being the next Victor Hedman, but the matter of fact is that Victor Hedman in his draft year was a top pairing defenseman in the SAL, putting up over 0.5 points per game and looking better than most guys who played NHL and came back. Hedman is ahead of where Silyev is right now when he was 15 years old. In terms of his offensive game, in terms of his transition game. So he's the guy, he's going to be a good NHL player, but for me, he's more likely to be a number 4 or a number 3. And you saw that in the MHL playoffs. I was watching quite a bit of him in the junior playoffs. And for a guy who people are talking about as a top 5 pick, you don't expect someone to kind of go missing for such enormous periods of time and get beaten by junior players. It's not to say he doesn't have talent, but I think people are salivating more over the size than the skill set, really.
Gotcha. That's interesting. Yeah, because I know there was a lot of theorizing, I feel like, in the beginning of the draft of the year, that the Flyers, given their love of, their professed love for size on the back end, that he could potentially be a guy that Jones and Briere might love. Now I feel like the general consensus is that he's almost certainly not going to be there at 12, but it seems like in your mind that might actually be a good thing.
Yeah, I think so. I think that there'll be defensemen with higher upside available at 12 for the Flyers, most likely.
Moving to the second first-round pick. Now, obviously, we don't yet know whether that's going to be 31 or 32. It's going to depend upon how Florida does in the Cup Final. Off to a decent start, up 1-0, but given the fact that Edmonton outshot them like crazy, that series could turn real quick. So we don't know exactly what pick, but we know it's one of those picks. Let's hear, again, asking for your top 3 realistically. Most likely you're not going to have one of those top guys. A Constellanes is going to slip to 31 or 32. But in terms of realistic possibilities of guys who you think might actually be there, who would you say your top 3 options are?
I mean, my clear number 1 is Nikita Atamonov. I can't believe that he's potentially seen as a guy who falls out of the first round, if I'm honest. I think it's madness. And I'm being very strong-worded there, but it's happened before with some of these Russian prospects that for one reason or another, they've just continued to fall despite doing things that are preposterous. And what he's done this year is really, really impressive. And I don't think maybe people understand just how impressive it is. He put 23 points up in 54 games while not playing big minutes in the KHL for a team who, while they value young players and they do play young players in big minutes, aren't an exceptionally good team. When you look at what he did this year, only Michkov, Tarasenko, and Panarin are the only players in the KHL's 15-year history to do better point per game wise. And it's not like he's a guy who's this all flash, no substance player who's just, he's not a less talented Nikolai Zherdev, for example. Like, this is a guy who's kind of a workhorse in a lot of ways. You know, he's not this small, skilled Russian winger who only plays in the offensive zone. He's like an energizer bunny, voracious on the forecheck, diligent in defensive zone, has an active stick, disrupts lanes. And while he's not super physical, he's like really happy to go to corners, go to the net front. And alongside that, he's a great skater and a great passer. He's really good at getting free ice. So, yeah, for me, the only real downside with him is that his shot isn't fantastic. I would say in some ways, and some people might disagree with me here, he's kind of like a smaller Mikhail Bransenigor in the way he plays the game. You know, he's a guy who, even if he doesn't hit as a first-line winger or a second-line winger, you could plug him in your middle six, and if he only put up 40 points, playing a kind of energy role on a wing, people would love him. So he's my guy who it just baffles me that he's not penciled in as a top 20 pick in this draft. So he'd be my number one. And then the other two guys, I would say are less well-rounded and have more problems. But for me, I still, if the Flyers are picking at 31 or 32 and he's there, Aron Kiviharju, he's fell enormously. You know, 2 years ago, if anyone said Aron Kiviharju, everyone would be like, oh yeah, the potential number one pick in the 2024 draft. And now it's looking like he might fall out of the first round entirely. And I can see why. You know, his physical skills are not impressive. Like, he's small, he doesn't skate very well. I mean, he's not a bad skater, but he doesn't skate great. But for me, like, he's got a really high IQ, and he's got really, really impressive kind of skills in general. So in terms of upside, yeah, he's a guy who there's a danger he doesn't even become an NHL player. Totally acknowledge that. He might just be a good EuroLeague player or kind of like a top AHLer, because I doubt he's less than that. But if you're talking about swings and the Flyers do need high-skilled players, I do think there's still the potential for him to be maybe not a number one defenseman, but a number 2, 3 defenseman, because his hockey IQ is better than a lot of NHL players already. He's still 2 steps ahead of the play, even without, you know, having great skating. And he does have like great vision, good passing, pretty silky hands, means he's like a good transition player as well. And it's not like he's bad defensively. You know, he's pretty strong down low with an active stick. So while I see the holes and I see the concerns with a late first round pick, he's a guy who I would really consider in such a spot. And I would say then the final guy that I would really think about late on, who is generally regarded as a second rounder in this draft, is Luke Misa. He's another guy who's a bit undersized. You know, his little brother is in contention for number 1 pick next year, Michael Misa. But what I like about Luke is he plays like a really high tempo game, like really good on the forecheck, drives off the rush, and he's also a good passer and plays at a high pace. I don't think he's a guy who's going to be a first-line player or has a real potential to be a first-line player, but for me, he could be a 50-point player, and they're really difficult to get once you get past kind of 20th overall. He's a guy in a funny way who I can imagine him ended up like somewhere around the level of someone like Luke Evangelista, another guy who fell kind of a bit later in the draft than he probably should have done, has a high talent level, good work ethic, plays an up-tempo game, and is, a bit undersized. So they would really be my 3. And the thing with Misa is, even though, you know, he can play center and he has played center at times this year, I do think he's a winger going forward. But they'd be my 3 guys to watch out for in the late first round.
Yeah, with Kiviharju, it's interesting because I guess this is when it kind of comes down to, because I like him too. I don't know if I would take him with a late first, not because I don't think he's a first round caliber prospect, but because everything I'm reading is saying that he very well could slip to the second. And this is where, you know, you wonder, you don't want to get too cute, but also if he's a guy you like, do you think you can get someone else with that late first and then maybe get him with your pick in the second round instead, you know?
Yeah, I have a hard time seeing him falling all the way to 51.
Yeah.
I don't think he will, because I don't think he'll fall that far. I think someone's just going to go, well, you know, when you look at the defensemen who are lining up, once you get past the guys like Alphonse Frey, etc., there aren't many guys I think who have that kind of upside. So I do think that the latest he's probably going to fall is like 40 something. So I do think if the Flyers were going to get him, they'd have to either draft him late first or maybe trade down with that first and get an early second instead.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's possible. I know from what I've talked to, you know, the people around the Flyers, they're assuming that Columbus is going to keep their pick, but I guess it's possible that Columbus gives up that early second and then they have an early second round pick as well, and maybe he's a fit there. Alex, this has been great. I guess one last question for you, and this really dates back to, you know, when we first started working together. you've become someone who just knows everything about European prospects and really prospects in general. But I remember when we first started working together, your niche really was Swedish prospects. You knew the SHL, the Allsvenskan, the junior leagues better than anybody. This, for whatever reason, it seems like it's a weaker Swedish draft, especially in comparison to recent ones. I guess, why do you think that's the case? And do you think there are guys that maybe will surprise 4 or 5 years down the road from this class from Sweden?
Yeah, it's a weaker class for sure. I think part of that is simply just chance, because next year's Swedish class has a lot of really good players. It's got a lot of guys who have potential to be 70-plus point forwards. And I think this one, it's just kind of, there's a lot of guys who are probably going to be NHL players, but just really not many players who are going to go out and be top players. I don't think there's going to be a Swedish player taken in the top 25 of this draft, most likely. I think the highest guy who will be taken is probably Alphonse Frey, who he is a guy who I think can surprise. I think he's a guy who potentially could be a number 2-3 defenseman because he's incredible in transition and he has a really quite a well-rounded game. But there's been a few players who kind of fell off, I would say, in the last year. You have a guy like Edvin Nielsen, who is probably going to go in the mid-rounds, who up until this point last year was seen as a potential first-round pick. He was doing incredible things for HV 71 as a 17-year-old, and he's just not really kicked on. And then you have a guy like Zetterberg as well, who 2 years ago was talked as a potential top 10, top 15 pick. And he hasn't grown. He's tiny. And on top of that, he hasn't quite kicked on to the next level that most players who you would expect to be first-round picks have. So I would say Frey is a fantastic player, and he could be a real surprise. And also Noel Franson. He's a guy who wasn't even ranked on Central Scouting's list. I imagine he'll probably go like third round or something like that. Fantastic offensive game. He has other things to clean up, and he's not the best skater in some ways, but he's also a guy who might surprise going forward. So they're the two I would pick out as one late first. He might outkick his coverage, and then a guy who's probably going to go third round or so, who also might impress. And then there are guys like, a guy like Evan Nielsen as well, who a few years down the line might be, a strong puck moving number 4 defenseman if he gets back to the level he was at 16. But overall, yeah, the Swedish crop this year, I think he's just going to end up having quite a few middle 6 forwards and number 4 defensemen, really. I don't think there's anyone who's likely to get to that 60-plus point forward or, number 2 defenseman level.
Yeah, it's just usually the Swedish class seem to be stronger. And, when I was doing my research, you had guys like Frey, you had Salem Wallenius, there's the Eriksson and Pettersson, the 2 potential centers. But beyond that, it just really didn't seem like there was anybody that were catching the scouts' eyes. And I know you watch a ton of those leagues. So
yeah, it's just a lot of kind of guys in a similar level. Like there's guys like Simon Zeth, Oscar Voulay, William Samuelson, who I think people he's probably going to go higher than a lot of people expect. He might go 100, 120 or something like that. But lots of these guys are just a similar level of, they might be third-line players. They might be number 4 or 5 defensemen. So there's not really many standouts from this Swedish class.
Gotcha. Well, Alex, thanks so much for joining us. We might have you on later this month when we get closer to the draft. I know that we're working on some content for you on the written side for our diehards, so keep an eye out for that as well. But Alex Appleyard, again, he's one of the best draft analysts out there in the public sphere. So check out his stuff both at PHLY and also at Smart Scouting. Thanks so much, Alex.
Yeah, pleasure, Charlie.
So that was Alex Appleyard, our prospect expert here at PHLY Flyers. Definitely give him a follow on Twitter if you're on there at AV Appleyard. Gave some really good insights on players like Berkly Catton, Costa Hellenius, gave a couple options at the 31-32 spot. So hope you enjoyed that. And before we go, just want to say, because we did talk about this at the end of the interview, become a diehard at PHLY. Alex is going to be doing articles for us in the lead up to the draft that will be available to diehards only. Him and I are working on a collab piece that should be out later this week. And then Alex will have another piece later on in the month about his preferred sleepers. So the only way you're going to be able to read those stories is if you become a diehard. So check that out. But it's not just diehards that we're working on here at PHLY. We also have events, and we have the PHLY first annual Liberty Open on July 13th at Valley Brook Country Club in Blackwood, New Jersey. Definitely sign up for that. I was actually talking with my boss about putting together some sort of team today. It's a scramble style golf tournament. I'm not very good at golf, so might try to get some help on the team standpoint. And then finally, this is the big thing for PHLY Flyers viewers and listeners. We have the BSH and PHLY draft party. It is Friday, June 28th at Bet Park Sportsbook on Packer Avenue in South Philly. That's right near the stadiums. It will start at 6 p.m. Watch a draft with Bill and Kelly and the Broad Street Hockey crew. I will be in Vegas at the draft, but maybe I'll be able to find a way to call in and give some updates on what I'm hearing on the floor. Screw the Masters. This is a tradition like any other. We've been doing these draft parties for years, and we would love to see you there. And that's all the time we have for you today on PHLY Flyers. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks for listening. Thanks to JP, and thanks to Alex Appleyard for joining the show. We will be back with you tomorrow, myself and Kelly Hinkle. It's the final day of Bill Matz's vacation, so last day I'll have to do the ad reads. Thanks for sticking around. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening.
We all silly like the mayor.